Thank you a lot for joining us and in this side event on climate impacts and responsibility and justice. My name is Adrián Martinez. I'm the director of La Ruta del Clima. This is an event that our organization with AIDA is co-organizing, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you all and have a nice dialogue on why climate justice is important, why we have to and our countries have to be responsible for their missions and responsible for the negative impacts that climate change has on our communities. So before we start, I would like to set some rules and that we all are clear on how will this work. This is a space that we want to dialogue. Hopefully, we can all be respectful to each other, and it's a space that we hope that we can learn from each other, that we can see and hear different perspectives on the issue of climate justice and responsibility in terms of climate impacts. And also, I will please ask you to keep your microphone silent when you're not speaking. And also, if you have questions, and we'll address them at the end when the panel stops participate, make their interventions, and then we'll so, give a space for the panelists to respond. So please do, while the presentations are undergoing, write your questions in the chat box in the Zoom, so we can read them afterwards. Before we start, I would like to explain a little bit how the program or the panel will take place. I will give some opening remarks explaining why did we think it's very important to talk about climate impacts and responsibility and climate justice in this context, and especially thinking on the next COP. And the event will start with short interventions by each panelist that will take around 7 minutes each, and then we'll have around 10 to 15 minutes, a space of 10 to 15 minutes to address the questions. So basically, that's the program that we have. And in terms of why we chose to, or what we were very interested on having a space and bringing all these very important and very knowledgeable experts that we have now to discuss on responsibility and climate justice in regards to climate impacts, is because we know that, and we all have seen in our communities the disproportionate effects and negative effects that climate change has on vulnerable communities. We know that it's unfair. We know that in most cases, these communities that are enduring these negative impacts and that which are affecting their human rights and their livelihoods are the least responsible for causing climate change. And as we know also, climate change is an issue that is generated by the action of persons, and therefore we're entitled to explore and ask for responsibility and justice in regards to the consequences of climate change. Also, unfortunately, loss and damage, which is the result of these impacts, is one of the least developed issues within the UNFCCC. Is one that lacks finance, that is constantly faces the obstruction of major emitters, developed countries that do not want to be held accountable on their historic and differentiated responsibilities in terms of climate change. And this is sort of materialized in the territories, in the communities, when we see our peoples having to face the impacts of climate change by themselves, with no funding, whatever means they have at hand. And finally, we want to make a connection on this active avoidance of responsibility that we can see through structural normative instruments such as paragraph 51 of decision 1 of COP21, which does not allow us to talk about compensation and does not allow us to talk within the UNFCCC about liability in terms of loss and damage. That there is a connection between this desire of major emitters to not be held accountable, and also with maintaining or refusing to have an ambitious enough climate action in their country. So increase emissions, increase climate impacts, it's connected through inequity, and it's connected with this active desire to avoid responsibility. And sort of to lead us in this discussion, we have today an amazing panel that I'm going to present to you. And first, we have Ingrid Hausinger from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Thank you, Ingrid, for joining us. She will talk about the impacts of climate change from the perspective of vulnerable communities in Central America. Then we have Astrid Puentes. She's the co-director of AIDA. She's very experienced in issues regarding human rights and climate justice, and she will explore a little bit about carbon emissions and inequity, and sort of try to share about this link between emissions, climate impacts, and inequality, and why this is relevant to explore, and why there is an element of justice there. Then we have the pleasure to have Margareta Verke Singh from the Grotius Center for International Legal Studies. She's a researcher on loss and damage and human rights and inequity, and she will talk about the connection between climate justice and loss and damage in the global south context, and these linkages between human rights and loss and damage that we require to have very present in the narrative within the UNFCCC. And finally, we have Mr. Guillermo Zúñiga from Earth Justice. He's an experienced international lawyer, and he will be talking about just transition and carbon leakage, and sort of coming to a circle in this relationship between emissions and loss and damage that we cannot live without exploring it. And after this, we have a very nice space where we can explore the questions from the audience. So without saying more, I'll give the floor to Ingrid Hausinger, so we can talk a little bit about how does climatic impacts look like in Central America in communities. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you to Ruta, Clima, and AIDA for the invitation to be part of this climate dialogue. And so when talking about climate impacts from the perspective of vulnerable communities in Central America, justice is clearly or plays a huge role. And here in Central America, this intersection between social justice or social injustice and climate change is very clear. It feels very present, at least at the community level, where there is a sense of injustice, and there is also a sense of knowing that they were not this vulnerable, but that they have become so vulnerable due to this global climate crisis that was born out of historical injustice and highly unequal responsibilities and behaviors that, as you said, go from the individual beings, but also from entire societies, countries, and corporations. So when we approach the climate change impact in the level of community, it is important that we view this as part of a large process that is interconnected with a wide variety of topics, such as poverty, migration, health, land rights, land use, natural resources ownerships, cultural rights, etc. And specifically, when we address the impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities, we cannot allow the discussion on climate change and their impacts or the policies that are being developed to address this to center the narrative on the effects on the emissions rather than the whole economic, political, and social injustice that is the result also of this unequal behavior and historical injustice in our society from the global south to the north south. So we should take into account first the existing inequalities and vulnerabilities that produce these so-called double exposures, where first they are exposed to the climate change itself, but also address how the impacts on climate change are mediated by factors such as poverty, infrastructure, or even the responsiveness of the political local authorities. So in the second point, we have to pay a lot more of attention to the effects that generate all the extractive industries in the territories and the communities, since these same industries that are responsible for the climate change at first place, like fossil fuel industries, mining industries, monoculture, of course, and even these mega projects from hydropower plants, they also affect the communities and their possibilities to adapt or react to climate emergencies. And since this industry not only cause environmental damages and health issues, they have profound changes in a community. I just want to share one picture. I don't have a presentation. And I just want to share this picture. This is Azacualpa. This is a gold mine in Honduras. It's the biggest open gold mine in Central America. And there has a lot of issues around this territory, of course. The community around Azacualpa is a community of Lenca people, and they were displaced by the company to these houses. I wanna, okay, wait a minute. Can you guys see it? To these houses. This is the new Azacualpa complex of houses that the Minerals and West, is called the company, built to relocate an entire Lenca community in Honduras. And if we see these houses, the first thing that we notice is that they are not at all the typical house or traditional house that we have here in Central America. One of the most important things that has a rural house here in Central America is the backyard. And the backyard is a key element for resilience and for response in climate emergency or emergencies at all. And the backyard is one of the most important places for the women. They cultivate food there. They have chicken, they have herbal medicines, they have vegetables and fruits. And these houses don't have backyards. With the backyards, the women can allow to exchange each other food if they are in a situation of crisis. They also can sell some of this food or the products that they cultivate in the local store and manage to save a little bit of money or even to hide money for crisis. So these houses really make the communities less resilient to climate change. So that's what I wanted to show this picture, because I think it says a lot about how these industries affect the territories and the communities. It's a profound change that is not only about who has the rights and the ownership about a territory or the water in the territory.
Thank you, indeed. And yes, as you say, there's in terms of resilience and how communities are vulnerable, it's not only what the influence of climate change itself, but also the context where it takes place. And there's also a connection between, as you mentioned, where the emissions come from, as also in terms of what also generates contextual vulnerability in communities. And now to explore a little bit more about inequality and in carbon emissions, Astrid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And it's really a pleasure for us to be in this climate dialogue and contribute with this very important conversation. And we really want to highlight how important it is to coordinate and to dialogue between the global north and the global south, because one key thing that it's painful to me that I've been working for decades in this and for the community is that we are not achieving the results that we need, that the planet needs. And so we really need to continue dialoguing and identifying the lessons learned and identify what we need to do differently. And that is what climate justice is. And that is one of the things that I wanted to highlight today. So as Ingrid mentioned, the climate crisis is already hitting hardly the people that have less responsibility on this. And this is the key core of what we're talking about when we talk about the climate crisis. While millions of people are already being impacted, the real responsibles for this crisis are not contributing with the responsibility that it's needed. And how do we see this? So as Ingrid was mentioning, and as we saw in the news, worldwide, we are seeing the impacts. For the last few weeks, hurricanes have hit Central America and the Caribbean in ways that have never been hit before. I am Colombian and I'm based in Mexico. And there's an island in Colombia, Providence, that for the first time in history was hit by a hurricane. And because of the examples that Ingrid mentioned, the lack of infrastructure, poverty, the lack of medical services, and remind us that we're in a pandemic, the island was completely devastated almost to 100%, like 90% of the infrastructure was devastated. And we are seeing that also in Nicaragua and El Salvador, in Mexico, Tabasco, there is a region where that is very vulnerable. It's also now living through floods. And at the same time, the same state, Tabasco, is where the Mexican government is wanting to start a new refinery. So these are examples of the things that we need to do differently. We cannot have, especially in vulnerable areas, continue depending on fossil fuels. There are a lot of reports and research about how green gas emissions are continue increasing. At the UN, we know, and for those that do not know, there is a report that is called the gap emissions. And so it research about where do we need to be in terms of the emissions and where are we? And each year those emissions are rising. And at the same time, we're seeing the impacts rising. The other thing that I wanted to mention, thinking about inequality, is that 100 companies only, mostly from the fossil fuel industry, are responsible for 71% of those emissions. And when we see the contributions in terms of technology, assuming the situation, advancing obligations and finance, it's nothing close to what we need. One key fact that I wanted to share as well is that there is research, specifically in the US, about how much these companies, fossil fuel companies, knew at least from the 60s. So for 50 years, these companies knew about climate change, and instead of advancing measures and actions, what they did was fund climate denial and have been lobbying against the advance on measures that the globe needs. And we are also even seeing that with a research recently published where General Motors and Ford, so automobile companies in the US, were exactly doing the same thing. And this is what we mean about responsibility, that the companies and governments that are responsible for these emissions actually assume this and implement the results and the measures that the world needs. I also want to highlight in the space that I have how much the impacts are disproportionate for communities that are in more vulnerable situations. And this is especially, we're living that in Latin America, that is the most unequal region in the world. So where we see that there is a group of companies and the elites that have more land and resources, and then most of the population that is impacted is the one that are in more poverty situation. And we see that also in other regions in the world. And to this, we have to add the situation of already the threats for human rights. And this is one thing that I want to link this. When we're talking about the climate impacts, we are already seeing the violation of human rights. So it's the human rights to life, to dignity, to education, to food, housing, and this is already being recognized by the UN in Latin America, but the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So there are already obligations of states. I want to close because of time. We need to advance these actions, and there are obligations. States have the obligations because these climate impacts are linked with human rights. There are the general, in human rights law and international human rights law, the treaties and the main obligations of states are to protect, respect, and guarantee human rights, which is something that we're not seeing. None of the NDCs in Latin America and most of the world, and mostly from the governments that are most responsible for the climate crisis, none of the actions are actually to the level that responsibility and that action needs. One thing that we're also saying that we have to be careful is that sometimes those climate solutions are actually also violating human rights. So it's not only about protecting for the climate impacts from the floods, fires, the hurricanes, the droughts, but also make sure that the transition The energy transition, for example, with renewables and farm and solar energy and wind energy is implemented respecting human rights. And that's something that we're not also seeing, and that we need to be implementing every climate action with a human rights perspective. Because if not, what we are seeing is more poverty, increase of conflict. And again, unfortunately, that is something that we're seeing in Latin America, that at the same time, it's the more unequal region in the world, but it's also the most dangerous region for people that protect nature and the environment. And a lot of these communities and leaders are working for the climate action and climate justice, and are already being under threat and sometimes killed. And that is part of the responsibility of the companies, governments, institutions that are continuing pushing the climate crisis, and unfortunately continue increasing the emissions, while all of the actions, including for loss and damage, diminishing emissions, etc., are not happening. So I just want to close there, and I'm happy to continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Astrid. And yes, as you mentioned, equity and responsibility are principles of the Paris Agreement, and that is something that we need to connect with human rights. And now to talk more directly on loss and damage and its connection with human rights in the Global South. And Margareta, please do take the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Astrid, I'll pick up where you left about the obligations. So obligations are so important because we see there are lots of commitments and promises that are not legally binding, or that are binding but are not being implemented. So we have provisions on, keeping temperature rise below 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. We have provisions on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. We have the SDGs with SDG 10 on tackling inequality, but it's not happening. We're on track for 3.2 degrees of warming. Inequality is still on the rise, and the burden of dealing with loss and damage remains on the victims. So when looking at the tools that we have at our disposal to try to correct these injustices, human rights are important because of the emphasis on correcting historical injustices and preventing future injustices, and also the obligations of states to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights, and obligations to provide remedies to victims. So there is the maxim: when there's a right, there is a remedy. We're talking about these rights being violated. It means that as a matter of legally binding international law, victims have a right to redress, and it includes victims of human rights violations that happen at the source of emissions, such as in the gold mine in Honduras, and other indigenous populations affected by fossil fuel extraction. That includes those whose rights are violated as a response of false solutions, and other response measures that violate human rights, or adaptation measures. It can be biofuels or other response measures. And of course, also those who are suffering loss and damage resulting from climate change itself. That all sounds very nice, of course. The question is, where are we in actually ensuring that that rights are protected, and that victims whose rights are violated can access redress? So let's look at the landscape of where we are and where we need to go in two areas. The first is litigation, and the second is the negotiation process under the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. So significant inroads have been made in claiming accountability, responsibility of mainly governments, and to a lesser extent also corporations, for climate impacts, or for climate action or inaction. We see that an increasing number of cases is based on human rights. outside of the United States, close to half of climate cases is already based on human rights. And but when we look at the kind of cases that are being litigated, we see that most cases focus on mitigation rather than adaptation. There are only 5 cases so far that focus on adaptation. So it's really about preventing future impacts, but cases do not really deal with addressing impacts that are of rights violations that are already being suffered by people on the ground. And we see that it focuses mainly on emission reductions. Even in cases that involve actual victims of violations, usually the remedies asked for focus on mitigation and do not really contain claims for redress. And there's several reasons. It's usually, I think, mainly pragmatic reasons that it's harder to claim redress because you have to prove causation, and it can be politically sensitive. So especially in the global north, it's easier to get the public on board if you say that, oh, all we want is climate action. But if a rich society that has become rich because of past, essentially, being able to benefit from pollution, that if you ask as a society to pay for the damage that happens as a result, that may be a less popular cause of action. So that is probably one of the reasons why many of these cases, especially in the global north, are mitigation-centric. But nonetheless, even these mitigation-centric cases can provide a basis for future litigation, which can in turn enable redress for harm suffered. So the inroads that have been made include confirmation by courts around the world that human rights apply to climate change, human rights obligations apply to climate change. There's really no court that has denied that human rights law is applicable. So from courts around the world, we have these judgments that say that human rights are relevant to climate action. The Climate Change Convention is relevant to the interpretation of human rights. And the right to life, for example, is affected by climate change, the right to a healthy environment, other rights as well, the right to private and family life, human dignity, culture, economic, social, and cultural rights. That's been affirmed by courts, as well as, of course, by the UN Human Rights Council and treaty bodies and by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But that is no longer controversial. A decade ago it was, but today no longer so. Where it gets tricky in litigation, we see, is the point where the court needs to tell or needs to decide on what is exactly the portion of responsibility of a particular state. So what exactly does a state need to do its fair share of mitigation? In the agenda case in the Netherlands, the court found, very importantly, that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is important for answering that question. So the historical responsibility of states has to be taken into account. That is a big victory for the climate justice community. And in that case, the court was able to decide on a particular range that within which the pledge of the Netherlands must fall to be legal under human rights law. But in other cases, courts have found it difficult to pinpoint the exact contribution that a state needs to make, and therefore some cases have been less successful. Standing has also been a problem in some cases for plaintiffs. The court found that they couldn't show specific injury. They couldn't show that climate change was impacting them specifically, and therefore victims have been denied remedies. So where there's room for progress is in closer collaboration between the scientific community and the legal community, where advances that are being made in attribution science, the science that links emissions on the one hand to impacts on the other, that needs to be capitalized on more in human rights litigation. Plus, there needs to advance climate justice more fully through litigation. There need to be more cases involving those who are most seriously and directly affected, supported by good legal teams and sufficient funding. And that's the litigation from it. There are some exciting cases that have been decided and some exciting cases that are pending. But if you see where much of the harm is suffered, then you see that especially there, access to justice is a big issue. It's for many reasons, and people are not able to access redress for violations. Now looking at the negotiation landscape, we have Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, and the question is how to operationalize it. What the most vulnerable countries are saying is that the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage that has been anchored into the climate regime through the Paris Agreement needs to have a financial arm to be able to disperse funds that can actually provide some form of redress to victims. And where does that money where should that money come from? These are huge amounts, of course, that would need to be mobilized. Well, the logical source is from the polluters. And what is needed to achieve that? You need to regulate them, you need to tax them, or find ways to make sure that they actually pay for the damage that they cause. And multilateralism is still the best way to go to mobilize these funds. Otherwise, you just never reach all victims all around the world. Litigation cannot achieve that. It needs to happen at the global level with participation of all vulnerable countries. So, do we have anything like that, like a finance arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism? Not at all. There's still not a single penny actually going to, the victims of loss and damage through the WIM. It is still a lot of talk and experts dialogue, but no real action. So last year, when the Warsaw International Mechanism was reviewed, the idea was it would be strengthened. Has it been strengthened? Not really. What the climate vulnerable countries were able to achieve was language in a decision that highlighted the urgency of scaling up funding, but not actually a call on the rich developed countries to scale it up or to provide funding, let alone anything like an obligation. And then a Santiago network was created to catalyze technical support for climate vulnerable countries, but again, nothing like tangible financial support. So civil society needs to increase the pressure probably on the negotiation process to make sure that these very basic demands of climate justice are delivered. I'll keep it at that and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Margareta. And I think you mentioned a couple of very important points. First of all, we're aware, and I think you made it very clear that we have a huge challenge on moving forward litigation, but also on restructuring the governance of loss and damage within the UNFCCC to reflect the fact that human rights are being violated, that this is undue harm, that communities should not be suffering, and that they have the right to access remedy and to have support from the international community due to these unjust climate impacts. And now to sort of help us close this link between emissions and climate change, we have Guillermo Zúñiga from Earth Justice that will expand on this connection. Thank you, Guillermo. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And thank you for the invitation to AIDA, sorry, to AIDA and La Ruta del Clima for this space for Earth Justice. It's an honor to be here. It is really convenient to be, the last speaker after very good participations, because you get the opportunity to pick up interesting topics and valuable topics that have already been put on the table. As for myself, I'm going to touch on this energy transition topic that Astrid talked about. Here, as an energy lawyer, I can tell you that electricity generation, energy production plays an important role on the climate crisis. Basically, we can no longer keep generating and distributing energy the way we do if we really want to fight climate change. As of today, and I can tell you, there is no way that you can separate and unbundle climate policies from energy policies. However, we see that it happens every day. Governments, regions, they just go on with energy policies, and they just plan plants, they just plan pipelines, just like there is no climate crisis going on. And that is not the way to go. However, if you look at the news, there are a lot of information that are somehow showing that things are moving forward. We see that coal is being, is being cancelled in many parts of the world. If you look at the world, the coal power capacity fell by 2.9 gigawatts just in 2020. This is important because it's the first time that coal has decreased in its capacity since it started as an industry. The USA, they have, in this country, I am a Mexican, but I am an immigrant, I live in California. There are 196 coal plants, and 334 coal plants have already been shut down or are already programmed to be closed. Just in 2020, in the US, they're going to close another 13. In the European Union, also very good news all over. You have many coal plants being phased out to meet Paris Agreement commitments. Austria, Sweden, Belgium, they no longer have coal in their electricity systems, and that is fine. That is very good news indeed. However, when you hear all these very good news from developed countries, then you see that if you go to the global south and underdeveloped economies, the share of coal is actually increasing. Actually, also the share of natural gas, which is, a very damaging fuel for its methane emissions, from production to transportation to the use in residential areas. So there is an imbalance. Actually, then we have this paradox in which there are many countries that domestically, they can show very nice credentials, green credentials, I am reducing emissions, I no longer have coal, I have huge investment in renewables, wind, solar, but you see that they are exporting coal, and they are exporting oil, and they are exporting gas to other countries. And they just go and say, you know what, I am not responsible for what other countries do with the product that I provide exporting. And that I think that is also part of the ramification of this historical injustice that we have seen in the last decades. And it will not be stopped until we take this into account for a climate change strategy that takes into account energy transition policies. This is also very important when it comes to thinking about how we can fight this. And then again, it has to do with access to justice, access to information. One of the reasons that you can see that there are many good grassroots movements being successful in the US, for instance, in California, fighting against utilities that used to rely a lot on fossil fuels, is that because they were informed? Is that because they had an understanding? Is that because the system somehow was transparent and you were able to see how damaging fossil fuels were for the climate? How these days in which technology has allowed us to see very cheap prices in solar and wind, actually 2/3 of the world, the population is located and based in countries that have a lot of solar radiation, like Latin America, Africa, Asia. One of the reasons why they were able to fight this is because they had a system that allowed them to get informed and aware that solar was cheaper and cleaner than natural gas. How can we see that in other countries? How can we take measures and modify regulations so a community can be a stakeholder and go to a government and say, you know what, I want to have an opinion on your planning, your energy planning. It happens a lot also in countries that have state-owned enterprises, monopolies, in charge of electricity. They are a black box, and there is no way you can know about their plans. you don't have a standing, you don't have an access, you cannot go and litigate, because in order to, I mean, once you don't have a standing sometimes, and even if you have a standing, you don't have the knowledge, the specific knowledge to know what is happening in the energy system in those countries. So there are a lot of things that you have to do in order to keep this clean energy transition moving forward, taking into account the rights, taking into account that you need to avoid injustices, and you need to give the communities a position in which they can be an effective stakeholder and advocate for their rights before the government and the courts. And I think I am up with my time, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Guillermo. And I think you mentioned a couple of important things, and activism and the ability to become empowered and aware of how resources are being managed and what is the actual effects of the commitments and actions of our countries is super relevant. And this also leads us to the connection between responsibility and irresponsibility, because what we have now after the UNFCCC was created, after the Paris Agreement has been made, is responsibility of countries, irresponsibility of businesses. And you see them in our countries opposing access rights, so people cannot be empowered, so people do not have the knowledge to be participant of environmental governance and climate governance. And now in the next section, and I still encourage you to please do make questions in the chat. We have one, and it is directed to Margareta, and it says, well, Marco is asking, what could be the main message or actions from Europe to USA and their relation with Central America, considering Biden's intention to fight climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good and interesting question. Well, I think the first point I would make, also as a European and not necessarily very proud European, is that the moral high ground that the EU or that Europe can claim in terms of promoting climate justice broadly, let's say, is limited. What the EU is promising to do in terms of mitigation is, of course, is much better than what the US is promising to do, but still it's not enough. So, you know, the targets, the European target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is a good step forward from what was on the table before, but it's not enough, especially not in light of, you know, the atmospheric space that is left for the global South to pursue development. It's still, you know, Europe has taken its piece of the pie. It's still taking a piece that is far too large of the global carbon budget with that target. Then if you look at finance and technology transfer to enable, you know, a transition to a carbon-free economy in developing countries, that is still a very small portion of what is needed. What Europe is providing. Foreign aid, even the UK is just announced that it's going to cut foreign aid from 0.7 to 0.5%. Very bad position. It also has implications for climate change, even though, of course, ODA is separate from climate finance. On loss and damage, Europe has been blocking progress. The ugly paragraph that we have in decision CP21 on, you know, excluding liability and compensation from the scope of Article 8 was also passionately supported by the European Union after it was proposed by the United States. When it comes to the current discussions on finance for loss and damage, Europe is blocking, not supporting. When it comes to migration, also really critical, climate-induced migration, we see that Europe's attitude towards migrants is usually quite hostile, lacking solidarity. So the first message for Europe to send to the United States is really, well, do better. But the first thing to do for Europe is really to improve its own record on across all of these areas. So giving a good example will be the best way to also regain or gain some moral high ground to be able to also inspire the United States to do much better in all these areas.
Thank you, Margareta. And I guess just to sort of open the floor, since I don't see more questions in the chat. I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned. There's a structural dissonance within the UNFCCC on how Article 8 is, how loss and damage is addressed. There is lack of finance. There is finance based on loans where the developed countries end up entering into debt. There is insurance where the vulnerable community have to pay to be secure from the climate impacts that they're not really responsible for. And also there's this opposition or sort of overzealousness of being too active on loss and damage within the UNFCCC to sort of not stop whatever progress that it's happening there, even though it's very small and even though it does not match what we see on the ground. And also, as you guys mentioned, there is this big challenge on how to move forward litigation on loss and damage, and it's sort of this lack of narrative or support to either financially or politically for this to happen. What can we do as advocates? What can we do as NGOs, as citizens across the world to help change this narrative, to make these structural changes that we need? And the floor is yours to answer it.
Maybe I will start and then others complement. So maybe the first thing to mention is that we, all of us in this room, and a lot of people have for decades mentioned that climate change is happening and all of the things that we need to do. And the main space where these discussions and obligations and commitments have been is UNFCCC. And with Article 8, as you were mentioning, Adrian, it has been really hard to advance. And because of the lack of commitments and effectiveness is that we use litigation. And because it's a tool that we need to have so that we can increase the ambition and the results that we need. And that is something that a lot of us are doing. And you talk about what citizens can do. So first of all, continue being informed. I want to remind what I mentioned briefly before, that companies, the fossil fuel companies and others have done a strategy to misinform, to lobby against the measures. And so we really have to be careful to make sure what is the information that we're having and rely on science. There's all academies worldwide have already mentioned this, so definitely have that information in mind and help everyone that is working on these spaces, including on the UNFCCC, to balance that millions of dollars being invested on lobby against climate action that we're seeing. The other thing is highlight the alternatives. There are many alternatives that we already know. Guillermo was mentioning the energy transition in the global south, where there's a lot of resources. We need to conserve ecosystems and nature. I want to highlight also the importance of the traditional knowledge of communities. So indigenous people, fisher communities, campesinos, they're not only victims, they have a lot of information and resilience. Ingrid showed us the houses and the comparison. So they have the traditional house in Honduras or in Central America and other countries with a plot where people can grow. That is more sustainable. And that is what we need to go to. So what we're seeing is going backwards. So continue including that, increasing leadership that we're not seeing, thinking about the US and Europe. And so definitely advance litigation as a tool. We're not going to solve the world with litigation, but at least try to find, to balance both information, access to justice, responsibility, finance, and redress really is something that we're trying to do so that the policies in our countries will actually be in service of the public interest and the communities rather than of the extractive industries, which is sadly and shamefully what's happening today mostly.
If I may, I would like to also comment on what Astrid mentioned. Litigation is a great tool in which by which you can assert your rights, you can fight injustice. And we have to use the tools that we already have at its maximum. There was a very good development a few weeks ago. The Escazú Convention was approved by Mexico. Mexico became the 11th country that ratified the convention, so the convention is now in full force. The Escazú Convention, as you may know, is a treaty that obligates all the governments, all the states that are part of the treaty to develop a standing environmental and energy, which is deeply involved with environmental aspects, access, transparency, standings. You have to take into account the vulnerability of groups. And so it gives us a huge tool that we have to use to empower ourselves by having more information that is not being shared today in many countries, more information about the environmental impacts of how the decisions are made. What can we be part of that decision-making process? The communities, the stakeholders that are going to be harm or benefit from these new decisions. These are tools that you have to take into account, that you have to be aware that they are and take it to the maximum. I do believe that the Escazú Convention can be of great use for climate litigators in the countries. I hope that more countries come to ratify the agreement soon and use them for the benefit of fighting injustice and giving another way to fight climate change and try to remedy, not only mitigate the harms that have been done to so many communities in these regions.
Hi, Guillermo, thank you for bringing out the Escazú agreement. I wanted to talk also about the Escazú in relationship with communities. Of course, the Escazú agreement fights for the right to defend your land, your territory as a human rights defenders and land defender. And I think we can all, as a society in general, try to go closer to the local communities, to the communities in the rural areas, indigenous communities, Afro communities in our countries, that are fighting these huge international firms that are really making the territory more vulnerable and expulsing the people from the territory. About 2 weeks ago, from the FAO, Julio Verdeguer made a statement, and he said that climate change generated 50% of the migration from the rural area from Central America. And also Oxfam made another story, and they showed that 90% of the migrants from the dry corridor in Central America and Guatemala and Honduras especially said that they leave their communities due to drought and climate changes effects in their territories. So climate change is being the first reason, not violence and not economy poverty, but the first reason that is given from most of the migrant people from rural areas from this dry corridor to be the reason to leave their communities. And as we know, the fact of leaving your community is the last resource that you as a family implement to survive. You have all sorts of resorts before you go to the decision to leave your community, to leave your people, to leave your family, and start over and in a different place and go through this travesty. So we have to be very conscious about the effects that climate change is having in these other issues that already are threatening the human rights in our countries. And we have to be vocal about it. We have to express ourselves and also activate ourselves and search the communities and try to be supportive and try to fight together for the land rights and the cultural rights that they have, because that's the only way that we're going to make the changes that we need. It is possible as a global society to remain under the 1.5 degrees Celsius. But of course, to do so, we have to make major changes in our economic and political systems. And we cannot sustain the profit margins of pollution or polluting countries or industries and we have that are still undermining social equity and human rights. We have to make these changes, and we are not willing to do these changes as a global community. And we have to try to fight and try to give the information to the people so that more people are willing to support this change, this radical change that we need to use. So from Central America, after these two hurricanes that hit Nicaragua in 2 weeks, 2 hurricanes category 4, there has never been something like that in a recorder or in the precedent recorded time. We are still trying to figure out the impacts of this hurricane in the region. The UN agency estimates that approximately 4.6 million people are affected, and the devastation left in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala is unimaginable right now. Guatemala and Honduras says that almost 80% of the beans has been lost, of the bean harvest and rice harvest. So we have to imagine these effects from one event that took from 2 events from 2 weeks that really devastated 3 countries right now. A little bit like Mitch, not with that many deaths. That's something that we are very glad about. Right now, there are almost 180 dead people from these 2 hurricanes, but the agricultural damages are huge, and this in a region that already half of the population live under poverty levels, and in a region where we have 5.8 million people in hunger. So if we put this effect of these 2 hurricanes upon the already existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, we can imagine that Central America is going to be having a lot more of young people leaving the country, searching for opportunities in other countries, since we don't have the context and the political will here in our region to start changing these realities for the people in the rural areas, especially, of course, women, indigenous people, and African communities. So we can start from the cities to try to build more closer relationships to the rural country and to be vocal and to support the fights that they are having in the local territories against these massive international companies.
Thank you, Ingrid. I don't know if Margareta, you want to comment? If not,
I guess, yeah, I see that it's time. So I'll just say something very, very briefly, and that is the importance of solidarity, because and a vision of solidarity. We need solidarity for climate justice, because the legal tools that we have allow us to make some inroads, but they're too weak to really provide the sea change that we need to get, you know, this transformation and achieve energy justice and climate justice and compensation for loss and damage. There needs to be also political demand for that, and that needs to come from people. So we need these connections between North and South, between rural and urban areas, between all different communities, and work towards a vision. So what we see, I think also, for example, in climate litigation, is a lack of vision. If you see, so people are going to court, they claim violations of rights, but then if you see what they ask for to redress the violation, that is often very, very limited. It's not really a full-fledged human rights vision. It is something technical, the cut of a certain amount of, you know, carbon. That's not a vision of transformation. So as a human rights or community of climate justice community of lawyers, activists, I think we need to do more work on what that vision looks like for all of us, and what is needed. What are then the remedies that we ask for when violations are found, and what is it that we want to get out of the Warsaw International Mechanism of Loss and Damage? We're calling for more finance, but what is that? How is that going to be spent, and who is going to benefit in what ways, and how are we going to all get better because of those processes. So that is, I guess, final point of thought that I wanted to provide. And I wanted to thank you all very much for organizing this event.
So now, I guess, just as a last thought in this discussion, as a Central American, when I think about recent events and the challenge that we have on restructuring the narratives and making the changes within the UNFCCC governance, I have this image of this Nicaraguan father standing or laying on top of the roof of his house, protecting him from being blown away by the hurricane, and just living through the hurricane on top of the roof of his house. So that's the level of stubbornness and urgency that we have to have as advocates, as experts on the issue of climate justice, on the issue of loss and damage. And I think that's the challenge that we have. There is no space to be silenced. There's no space to be just quiet, because that's not what we're looking into in the communities that are being affected by climate change. And as the communities are facing the consequences of climate change, so those that have been irresponsible countries or major emitters of companies have to face the consequences of the historical and current actions that have caused this crisis. So I thank you and welcome all your comments, and hopefully we can see more efforts like this, and hopefully we can collaborate on promoting climate justice and holding accountable these countries and businesses that have caused climate change and creating this human rights violation that we see in our communities currently. So thank you again for joining. Thank you to the panel and everybody that attended, and have a very nice day. And